Okay, so I'm trying to make it into 3 different recordings, so that way you guys don't have to sift through everything in case you want to look at something specific, okay? So we're going to talk about ethics, right? So what is ethics? Ethics are the standards of what's right and wrong that influence behavior. Why are ethics important? Well, they're important because lack of ethics really can hurt not just the people involved, but there's a lot of stakeholders. It can affect society in its gist, if that makes sense. So think of 2008's housing market. That's an example of that, right? Um, as I mentioned, ethics are the standards of right and wrong. Um, Ethical theories, they provide a system of rules and principles that are intended to help guide us in making decisions on what we consider right and wrong, right? Because there's so many corporate scandals, even today, it really led to the distrust of leaders. Something in the chat. Let me see. The word ethics, it has its roots in the Greek word ethos, which means to conduct or character, right? You're really concerned with the kind of values and morals that an individual or society is going to find desirable or appropriate. And you're going to see that our ethics, they skew and vary, right? It's estimated that only 30% of developed countries trust organizational leaders. I think that's actually kind of high. I think that with recent scandals, we're finding that water sources are being disrupted and tainted due to the unethical practices of corporations. We find that societies are being exploited. Um, innocent people are being hurt with our uses of things like tax abatement and outsourcing, etc. These are other examples of unethical behavior, whether you realize it or not, right? But in addition, there's other scandals like Volkswagen, Wells Fargo, Theranos, Amazon, Google. There's a lot. Uber, right? There's so many that you can source to show that this unethical behavior. Does that make it entirely wrong or bad? And we're going to talk about that, okay? So first of all, do you guys think that ethical behavior pays? Anybody? Yes, David.
I just had a question about the 30% of developed countries. I had a question. How much do you think that is? How much of that do you think is the United States itself?
Oh, to be honest with you, because this one isn't outdated because this book is kind of old. I actually should look it up and update it, but I honestly think that our lack in trust in organizations has somewhat wavered, but stayed the same. Because I honestly, I have this whole, I mean, you're going to open a can of worms here for me, but I honestly believe that people have become so unaware of things that they automatically are being fed due to like technology, due to we're continuously, like for instance, my niece, all she does is do TikTok. That's all she watches. So she literally has her moral concepts and her idea of news from TikTok. So in other words, there's no room for anything else because she only watches TikTok and TikTok said this and it has to be true.
Yeah, I was just wondering because with the amount of information nowadays, information so easily accessible, people could learn about like the scandals companies do, like Nestle, and how they tried to replace milk, breastfed milk with powdered milk or something like that.
You're
I
right.
was just stuff like that.
You would think that because the information has become so relatively available, that people would, look, but a lot of people don't, right?
Mm.
And a lot has to do with for instance, the formulas that are given, just like look at anything YouTube. I looked at one thing, how to make what were we doing? My wife and I. Oh, we were putting up blinds and we couldn't figure it out. So I was looking it up, and all of a sudden now I have like all this, algorithms trying to send me stuff about how to how to make things and etc. But I mean, it's an example of that, right? You go down this tunnel and it's almost like you got blinders on. But how many times do people actually look up information because they're interested in that information? I
Yeah.
rarely find people who do that. So I
Okay.
mean, sorry, I just went off on a whole tangent there.
Thank you.
You're welcome. But okay, so we were talking about, does ethical behavior pay? In reality, it does, right? Supposedly, most highly successful people are ethical. Once again, that's, I guess, would be based on perspective. But what they find, and this is true, they've done multiple studies that people who are honest tend to actually be healthier. Why is that? They're probably less stressed. They probably have less anxiety. They also found that they tend to have less back pain, right? Because we carry a lot of our emotions in our back, right? So people who are ethical, I'm sure that people who are unethical, although one of often Hollywood portrays unethical people to like be like breathing. It's something that's who they are. A lot of people, when you're being unethical, when you're taking advantage of people, and that is a cross that you have to carry. Some people carry it better, others not. But in reality, being ethical is supposed to be more helpful to your overall immune system and your overall happiness. So probably because you have a cleaner conscience. So when we talk about ethics, in reality, 1% of people are going to always be honest. 1% is going to always be dishonest, right? Those are the bad apples. And then 98%, well, they're going to be unethical at times. There's no such thing as somebody being always ethical. We're going to make mistakes, right? And we're going to be tempted. So, for instance, a lot of it is based on the context, the situation given. So I have a friend who is a manager at a Stater Brothers, right? It's not the same friend that was talking about the cameras, completely different. Okay, but this person told me a story about how an old man found $100 in between the sliding doors. Now, this man was completely ethical. He picked up $100 and he told management, which was him, and he said, somebody dropped this money. I don't know who. So I'm going to give it to you because I'm sure they're going to realize they dropped it and they're going to come back. So he said, thank you, sir. Right. And I said, oh, that's awesome. I said, did he come back? I mean, did the person come back and claim the $100? He's like, I don't know. I never put it up. He's like, I just stuck it in my pocket. And I said, wow, why? He's like, because somebody else on my team is gonna make the excuse and say that person came for it so they can keep it. So why don't I just keep it? Because he was automatically assuming that someone else is gonna be unethical and short circuit him from the $100. So he stuck it in his pocket and he kept it. Right? Because he had told the old man that if nobody came back, he even took his name and his number. He would contact him so that way he could have the money. And the old man laughed that off and he said, no, well, I'm sure they're going to come back, but thank you. That's really sweet of you. So the old man walks away thinking that my friend is being ethical. My friend is not being ethical because he didn't even keep his number or his name and he just put it in his pocket. He didn't even put it in the lost and found. So that is an example of the context. So I consider him to be an unethical person. Overall, I've known him for quite a number of years. I consider him to be a good person. But I mean, that's obviously something that's very unethical. It's borderline messed up, right? But the idea here is our ethical behavior, it's going to be related to our needs and our personality traits. So for instance, is it considered unethical for somebody who doesn't have a job or maybe doesn't have any money and they have to steal something to feed their child? Well, I mean, although technically that may be considered unethical because you're stealing from somebody, is it really unethical if they really need it? So that's another context, right? That's another social context that you have to consider. And, it's going to vary among perspectives, right? And it's going to vary among how you see power and authority, right? A lot also has to do with your locus of control. Emotionally unstable people, who have an external locus of control. Remember, those are the ones that believe that their fate is uncontrollable. It depends on that they have no play in their fates. They're going to be more likely to engage in unethical behavior. versus people who have positive attitudes about ethics, they tend to be more ethical than those who have a negative or weak attitude. Why do you think that people who are unethical tend to have a weak attitude about ethics? Probably because they engage in unethical behavior quite often, right? Anybody have any questions in regards to this? Right. So there is something called moral development. And that's the idea is that we evolve as people. So here's my little Legos. You see them. It's growing to be a little man Lego. The idea here is that your perspective of what is wrong and what is right and wrong is going to shift as you age and how you see society, and as your perspective grows in addition to your experiences. All of this comes into play, right? So, for instance, in the beginning, you're going to get your standards of what is right and wrong from your parents or from your mentors or those who are close to you, right? But as you begin to age, you're going to see that they're going to shift and you're going to develop eventually. Hopefully, you will develop it to your own person, right? So these levels, there's three main levels: the pre-conventional, the conventional, and the post-conventional, right? We're going to go more into depth about these, but pre-conventional, there's going to be self-interest motives, right? Here you want to meet your needs and gain rewards. So here maybe you have less control over your actions, right? So think of like a child. So if I tell Bobby, do not eat cookies until after dinner, but I've left them out and there's like 20 cookies, I'm sure Bobby's going to sneak one, right? Versus if there's two, it's going to be like, oh, she'll know. Okay, I can't have it, right? Or Bobby might engage and say, whatever, I'll get in trouble later, depending on also what that parent does, right? So does Bobby get punished? Does Bobby just get a scolding where say, Bobby, no, don't do this? Well, I'm sure Bobby could live with that and he gets a cookie. Or does Bobby not get treats for the rest of the week? Or does Bobby lose his privileges to TV or what have you, right? And level 2, conventional, this is when you're living up to the expectations of accepted behavior. And not only you're having the peer pressure, right? You want to be like everybody else. I don't want to be considered delinquent, so I'm not going to steal because that's not cool, right? Level 3, post-conventional. This is when behavior is motivated by universal principles, what you consider to be right and wrong, right? No longer should you create your standard of right and wrong on what people say, but it's when you inherently believe. Okay? So we're going to go into more depth about this. Okay, so plural stages of development in Kohlberg's. Sorry. So the pre-conventional morality, there's stages 1 and 2. Stage 1, obedience and punishment. At this stage, you're going to see that rules are fixed and handed down by authorities. So parents are telling their kids, don't do this because it's wrong. You're in kindergarten. You're not supposed to get up from your seat without raising your hand because it's wrong. In reality, nothing is going to happen to you, but you have that perception of what's wrong or right because these are the rules that have been handed down. So for instance, my sister and my niece are exactly the same age. They're like 2 days apart from each other. So they went to class all the time together, right? They went to the same school. So my sister was very rule fixed, right? She did not get up unless she was called or what have you, right? Versus my niece was more of sorry, not my niece, my cousin was more of a free spirit. So the teacher would tell her, you cannot get up, you have to raise your hand, I will call you and then you can get up. And although this rule was repeated to her several times, in her mind, they couldn't do anything to her. The only person she had to worry, her only rule of authority was her mother. So therefore, she did not fear the teacher or what may happen to her, right? So that's an example of that, right? But in this stage, obeying rules is important because it means avoiding punishment, right? And the second stage, which is individualism and exchange, an individual will make moral decisions based on their self-interests, right? An action is right if it serves the individual. So in other words, everything's going to be relative. So each person is free to do their own thing, but they identify with the community here. So rather than fear of punishment, their effort is made to secure the greatest benefit for oneself, right? So here you see that these are this first level. It's very raw, right? Because the idea here is that you're going to probably make decisions based on what is your over self-interest. So think of like Bobby and the cookies, right? Bobby wants a cookie, he needs that cookie, he's just going to get that cookie, right? But as you get older, you're able to self-manage those emotions more, those um, overall innate urges, so to speak, right? It's also important to realize that a lot of people don't develop morally like they should. So, for instance, you could be like 50 years old and still acting like you're 15. I'm sure people have know people like that, right? So that's an example of that. So when we talk about the conventional morality, stage 3 is interpersonal accord and conformity. So at this stage, the individual is going to make choices based on conforming to the expectations of others and trying to be like a good person. So in other words, I like to refer to this like middle school, right? This is when you have your shirt tucked in. Good morning, Mrs. Such and such. Good morning, Mr. Such and such. But then you're cursing and trying to smoke cigarettes behind, you know, behind the, I don't know, the gym or something, right? Authority and social order, stage 4. Is at this stage, the individual is making more decisions in ways that show concern for society as a whole. So maybe now they are beginning to think that obeying the law, it's important. They respect authority and support the rules of the community, right? So this is more of the conformist moral development stage, right? We're doing this because we care about the perception that other people have of us. So for instance, think of like I said, middle school. You want your teachers to think you're a good student. It does actually still serve in your best interest, right? Because maybe they're gonna be like, oh, if they catch you doing something bad, they'll be like, oh no, Jim has been such a good boy. It's probably just a mistake. I'll let him go with the warning. It's an example of that, right? Then when you get into your teens, that's the post-conventional morality. And this one is the social contract and individual rights. And at this stage, the individual is going to make decisions based on that social contract. I'm sure everybody knows what a social contract is, but let's just go through it really super quick, right? The reality is that every person is born with a certain extent of autonomy, meaning that you can go and stab anybody you want. Please don't do it. I'm just saying that that's something that you could do. You can go and mark anybody with a marker, right? Now, the idea here is that we sacrifice our self-autonomy for the sake of the greater good, right? This was John Locke. We enter into a social contract so that way for the benefit of all. So in other words, you don't go stab people because of the fact that one, that it's wrong, two, it's dangerous, and three, you don't know who you could hurt in the process, right? So now it's not just caring about yourself, it's caring about everyone and society as a whole. So therefore, when we engage in a social contract, when we choose to become citizens of this society, we do not run our car 100 miles per hour for fear that we may hit somebody completely innocent, right? Or that we may injure not just ourselves but someone else, or also for fear of repercussion, that we get caught and we spend various years in jail. That's an example of that, right? But now you see how we're shifting away from our self-interest and thinking about other people. That's really the gist of a social contract. That's what it's initially intended to be, right? The idea here is that you're caring about other people and understanding that your actions can affect other people, both in a positive or negative light. So keep that in mind. And lastly, the universal principles. At this stage, the individual's moral reasoning is based on their internalized universal principles of justice that apply to everyone. So for instance, when I was younger, I went to Catholic school. I literally went to a Catholic school from kindergarten all the way to 12th grade. I went to church 3 times a week, and they were always saying, hey, being gay is bad, being gay is wrong, right? Well, I'm gay, I'm married, I've been married for 6 years to my wife. um, because because of this lacking support from friends and my schoolmates, or those that I consider to be of higher authority, I really thought that there was something wrong with me being different from others, right? So this is an example of that, right? I didn't want to say anything about my sexual orientation for fear of being ostracized, but also for fear that I was doing something that was immoral, because that's what my religion told me. Eventually, I just decided that religion is made by man, so therefore, who's to say what is moral and what is not, right? So this is my universal principle. I feel that I do not need to go to church to know what it is to be a good person. I feel that being exclusive is a negative thing rather than being inclusive and accepting people for who and what they are, right? This is my universal principle, versus there are others who may differ from that. But the idea here is that the more evolved that we are, we understand the perspective of others and we respect them, right? Because that's what you do in a social contract. You respect others' opinions, right? The idea here is that you hold true to yourself and solely to yourself. Yeah. So the situation, as I mentioned, remember that 1% are good, 1% are always bad, and then there's the 98% that's going to vary according to the situation that is given. So situations can really affect ethical behavior. We're susceptible to social influence. Some people are going to engage in unethical behavior because maybe they're fearful of losing their job. They're going to engage in unethical behavior because their best friend is doing it and they don't want to be left out. They're going to engage in unethical behavior because it's what they need to do in that moment, or they feel that's their only option. And some are just going to behave in unethical behavior because it suits them. They don't think anybody's looking, right? But there are other concepts you have to consider. So for instance, like highly competitive and unsupervised situations. This would be a perfect example, Drew, for your article, right? Because you'll find that often students will cheat because they feel that they're being unsupervised, especially because they're doing a lot of studies right now with the pandemic. They're finding that more people are engaging in unethical behavior than they ever have before, right? That's also, I would probably, if you wanted to look a peer review article, that would be a good one to look up, because there are already articles that are being printed in regards to this. They find that it has gone up something like 400% or something like that. It's like a huge number. But the reality is why? Because people are taking exams now more online. Because they're taking exams online. There is something called respondus lockdown. I don't know if you guys know what that is, but really what it is that the camera, you have to have your camera on, and then it'll tell you if your eyes vary or skew to a different direction, it actually will give you the percentage of them looking. So like, let's say you're like, I'm gonna be smart. And it's almost like they're trying to make you almost like sit in the classroom where you're taking your exam, right? Because the camera's on and they're continuously evaluating your movement and your eye movements and ensuring that you are not cheating, right? That you're not like, you don't have any materials around you. So some people, they get smart and they say, oh, I'm gonna tape something on the wall and they're never gonna know. But the idea here is that how often are you moving your eyes? The camera's supposed to be evaluating all this. But there's other factors that you can take this with, right? So for instance, some people may not have the camera available. The quality of the camera may not be that great. The light may not be that great. So these are all other factors. In addition, I mean, like, it's important to realize just as this technology has increased to help students cheat, it's also increased on the other end to help professors and instructors see ways in which students are cheating. So for instance, respondus lockdown. I don't use it because there's actual ways for you to close respondus lockdown, so that way you can take your exam and no one will never know the difference, right? So when I shared this with my peers, a lot of them were really disappointed because they thought that this was going to be, the epitome of ensuring ethical principles, but in reality, it's not. So this is the reason why I include essays, because you can source questions from Course Hero, from Shag, from Quizlet, from so many different outlets. Uh, but you can't fake writing, right? Really, this is going to be how you the gist of what you know. And a lot of people will try to steal from the internet and catch them, right? Because once again, I'm able to look it up just like you guys are. So keep that in mind, right? But if you're, for instance, if you're in a highly competitive environment where you're forced to produce results, that can often lead to unethical behavior. So Wells Fargo is an example of that. I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with Wells Fargo, but the reality was that they were making they're making tellers, they had to meet a quota, right, of sales. If they did not meet that quota of sales, their job was continuously told to be in peril, right? So for fear, because it was highly competitive, they had to meet this quota, they found that a lot of tellers were going to their friends and family, encouraging them to open up accounts, right? And when that didn't work anymore, they started finding new and innovative ways to open accounts. They were opening accounts under their children's names, or their friends' children's names, or even dead people. So this was unethical behavior. And the idea here that makes it a scandal is that Wells Fargo trying to make it sound like it was a couple of bad apples, but in reality, it was systemic. It was from the top down, and management knew about what people were doing, but they were turning a blind eye to it, and that makes it unethical, right? And what sucks about all of this is that no managers or leaders of any type of authority were removed from their position, but a lot of regular, telemarketers, they were removed and fired for their unethical behavior. So do you see how they're the scapegoats? That's an example of that, right? Unsupervised situations when you're not being seen. So we tend to, if you're like, for instance, how many times as a teenager did you steal something, right? Even something small like a lipstick or what have you, right? You look around, you see, is there a camera? Is anybody watching me? And then you take it, right? That's an example of that. If you feel that you're not being supervised, you're more likely to engage in that unethical behavior. In addition, unethical behavior occurs when there's no formal code of ethics, or there is a code of ethics, but it is not reinforced, which often happens in organizations. So for instance, they'll say, yes, we're about inclusivity. We're about, promoting all genders. We are about, code of ethics. And they throw like a mini celebration about it. And then guess what? That's the end of that. Well, followers will notice when leaders are not trying to implement those code of ethics or those beliefs into the culture, right? If it does not become a priority for them, then the staff is going to notice that, and it will not be a priority for them, if that makes sense, right? So for instance, the article More Person, More Manager talks a lot about it's important that not only followers engage in ethical behavior, but leaders have to engage in ethical behavior. They have to not only walk the walk, but they have to talk the talk too, right? They have to be able to show and incorporate that not into just the culture itself, but also into their everyday life. Because we followers, they see a lot that you don't think that they see, right? Because we're observant, and just because you're a leader or follower doesn't make you stupid, right? You know what's going on. You know when people are taking advantage of you, right? And unethical behavior is more likely to occur when performance falls below aspiration levels. So, for instance, the Wells Fargo, like I told you, it was a lot of steps before the teller started to engage in that unethical behavior. As I mentioned, they were trying to open up accounts with their family members, their parents, then they open accounts for their children, et cetera, et cetera. But once again, this wasn't something like they 6 months they had to meet this quota. It was every month. So therefore, the stress is continuous, right? Another example of performance falling, let's say that you lose your job and you have kids, and maybe you're trying to get out there to get a job, but they're just, maybe you just can't seem to get one. Maybe there's, not the market for one at this time. So what do? Maybe you try to panhandle money, or maybe you see an opportunity to take something, maybe steal some food for your child. Is that considered to be unethical? Well, the situation is really what's dictating that unethical behavior, right? And lastly, people are less likely to report unethical behavior when they perceive the violation as not being serious. So, for instance, take the example that I gave you about um, when I about my douchey boss, right? And how that person who was stealing, she was a friend of mine. I knew her. Everybody liked her. She was a likable person. She had been there forever. And although I knew it was wrong what she was doing, I really didn't consider it to be as serious because she was my friend, if that makes sense. So the situation manipulated me, so to speak. In addition, as I told you, my boss was not exactly a nice person, so I didn't feel that I owed anything to her. So therefore, I kept my mouth shut, right? So it's also important to see that we often will do something called moral justification. We're going to talk about it a little bit in a minute. But the idea here is that we try to justify our behavior, because the fact that I didn't say anything is almost like engaging in stealing myself. I didn't reap any benefits, but I mean, by not saying anything, I allowed that behavior to continue. Okay. So, justifying unethical behavior, as I mentioned, there is something called moral justification. And this is the thinking process of rationalizing why unethical behavior is used. Um, why does moral justification exist? Because this makes the pills easier to swallow, right? By justifying your behavior of why it was unethical, why you were led to that unethical behavior. You feel like you can digest it better instead of saying I was lazy and I didn't want to study. You say, oh, I work so much, blah blah blah. And in reality, I'm sure there could have been some time for you to study, but you just, chose not to. That's an example of that, right? Other examples of justification, moral justification. Everyone does it, so what's the big deal if everyone does it? Or I deserve it. So for instance, that girl that was stealing, I'm just going to give you a small little background about her. She'd been there forever, right? But then she got pregnant. And because she had been there forever, she had a lot of days. So, and she was a really good worker, in all honesty. And they really had no reason to take her days away from her. But there was another girl that was kissing her booty, kissing the owner's booty to the top, right? And she wanted those days. So guess what? When she went on maternity leave, when she came back, uh, her days were cut, like literally. She went from having 5 days to like 2 days. And slowly but surely, they said, oh, well, we're still trying to work out the schedule. We're going to give you your days back. But they never did. So this infuriated her. And to make ends meet, that's the reason why she was stealing, right? So she was pretty smart about it. She would, let's say customer spends like $50. She would put the $50, they would put the $50 on the table, include her tax. She would stick it in her apron and never actually put it into the register. So therefore she copped all the money. That is how she stole, right? Now, her moral justification, when it was brought up to her, because friends did notice it and talk to her, she said, well, they don't want to give me my days back. What am I supposed to do? I did everything I was supposed to do. I, was never a bad employee. And they're doing this just because such and such is kissing butt. And that was true. It was true. But does that justify it? Not really, right? Because she could have taken other avenues. She could have reported it, etc. Right? So this is an example of that. But there are certain ways in which we justify unethical behavior. And these are some of the ways, right? So if you choose to talk about moral justification in regards to an article, you would want to include the ways that we often justify behavior. So that means this little list right here, right? So for instance, higher purpose. This is when you're going to rationalize moral behavior in terms of a higher purpose. It's for the greater good. So, for instance, that friend, she said, I'm stealing because I've got 3 kids and I need to make sure that I can put food on the table. Right? She forgot to mention that she lived with her mom and her husband had a job too. But, I digress. Right? Displacement of responsibility. This is the process of blaming one's unethical behavior on others. I was only following orders. This is what often happens in corporate scandals. You'll have people who have willfully engaged and are truly in knowledge of the unethical behavior that's occurring, but they say, well, I was only following orders. My boss told me to do this, so I'm just doing what I was told. Right? Diffusion of responsibility. That's the process of the group using the unethical behavior with no one person being held responsible. So in other words, everybody's saying, well, it wasn't my fault. I had nothing to do with it. I mean, you know, it wasn't my decision. Everybody does it. That's an example of diffusion of responsibility. Nobody wants to take accountability, right? Advantageous comparison. This is the process of comparing oneself to others who are worse. So in other words, let's say that you are taking, I don't know, let's say that you report to your boss that you have COVID and you really don't have COVID, but you want to make sure you get your COVID pay. So you can say, well, I mean, I've never taken a day off before, and I mean, this is supposed to be for everybody. What's the big deal about me using it now? That is an advantageous comparison, right? So, or maybe you take a sick day off when you're not sick and you say, well, I mean, I just took one day off, but at least I'm not like Sue over here where she, takes a day off whenever she wants. That's an example of advantageous comparison. Disregard or distortion of consequences. This is a process of minimizing the harm caused by unethical behavior. Well, for instance, if I inflict the figures, who does it hurt? It doesn't really hurt anybody. This would be what Enron sold people, right? What's the big deal about cooking the books? Just cooked a couple of books. Well, guess what? A lot of people lost their jobs. They lost their 401k. Very big deal. It was a very big deal, right? Attribution of blame. That's a process of claiming the unethical behavior was caused by someone else's behavior. So for instance, I think the book says something like it's his fault that I hit him, right? So in other words, a person prompted me and they forced me to respond. So normally you find with anybody who is involved in a violent relationship, this is often a common misconception, right? They justify behavior. You forced me to hit you. I didn't want to, but I had to, right? And euphemistic labeling. This is a process of using cosmetic words to make behavior sound acceptable. So for instance, maybe it's a terrorist group, but instead of calling it a terrorist group, we call it a freedom fighting group. That's an example of a moral justification, right? Because terrorist has a negative connotation, but if you say moral, if you say that you are freedom fighters, well, then guess what? That has a better ring and it almost feels like it's better to be engaged in that, right? Does anybody have any questions in regards to these? So once again, if you're going to use moral justification, you need to tell me what type of moral justification that character or that article is relating to. Make sense? So there are guides to ethical behavior. One is called the 4-way test, right? When doing the 4-way test, you should ask yourself 4 questions. 1, is it the truth? 2, is it fair to all concerned? 3, will it build goodwill and better friendship? And 4, will it be beneficial to all concerned? So for instance, if my friend who was stealing did this test, she probably would have failed all questions. 1, stealing, she would steal the tickets and then say, oh, I don't know what happened to that ticket. I know I turned it in. She's not telling the truth. Is it fair to all concerned? No, it's not, because although I do highly agree that the boss was a douche, that doesn't take away from the fact that those are her resources that are being used. So therefore, it's not beneficial to all concerned because she is being she's being exploited, right? The golden rule. You have to treat people the way you want to be treated. So in other words, you would not appreciate somebody to take advantage of you or to exploit you. So therefore, you should not try to exploit or take advantage of anyone else. Code of ethics. This is a code of conduct. State the importance of conducting business. So for instance, let's say that you have an article where you're talking about unethical behavior. Maybe you want to include this guideline, right? This would be a good example to include on how that organization or what have you can improve on their ethical behavior. You could use some of these if you wanted to. So code of ethics are good, right? But they're only good if they're actually implemented and reinforced, right? The idea here is that by saying we're not going to stand for this and meaning it, it's really what is going to what is really going to create the overall effectiveness of it, right? Because often being a leader is about taking action, and it's also about your lack of action. So for instance, if you don't take action on things that are needed, you're really saying something that whether you realize it or not, you're telling people that it's okay. So for instance, if you have somebody in your organization that is I don't know, harassing someone else, and you've already stated in your code of ethics that your organization will not stand for this, and you're playfully aware of this, then indirectly you are engaging in that action by allowing it to continue. Okay. So an example of this would be Uber, right? There were a lot of women that were being harassed. And because it was a very bro-like culture, um, the CEO turned his eye to it because they were making revenue. And what is the big deal? It's only a couple of bad apples. And guess what? The truth will, I feel like I sound like my mom when I say this, but the truth will always reveal itself. It can take a year from now, 5 years from now, but it'll come out. And when it comes out, it's going to bite you in the ass. So you might as well just engage in the ethical behavior to avert that. Because once again, because in reality, you're going to have bad apples and you're going to have things that happen that are beyond your control, right? Because leaders have something that's called the span of control. So the closer, smaller group knit, the better span of control you're going to have, right? Because you're going to be able to talk to them, you're going to be able to be on a one-on-one basis with them, right? Versus if you have an organization of 6,000 employees, your span of control is going to diminish because of the fact that you're not going to be able to go out there all the time and talk to all 6,000 people. So therefore, there's going to probably be a little more unethical behavior in that culture. But the idea here is for you to remain diligent, to have your managers remain diligent of this and to bite it in the bud, right? And if you're, for some reason, your organization has engaged in unethical behavior, that you're honest about it immediately. Because once again, it's better for you to turn yourself in than somebody else to turn you in. Because if they find out that you're unethical, they're going to question everything else about your brand. They're going to question everything else about your character. So that says a lot. Stakeholder approach. One creates a win-win situation for all relevant parties affected by the decision. How can you rectify the mistake that has been made? So let's say, for instance, I mean, honestly, to the girl that stole the check, there really was no remedy to this. She could have turned herself in. Maybe she could have given them the money, but I'm sure they probably wouldn't want to keep her employed because there probably would have been that question all the time. Is she stealing? Right? Because she already had betrayed their trust. Now I feel like a parent again, but trust is such a vulnerable and delicate thing. You have to make sure that you really care for that trust, especially from your followers, because once you break that trust, it's so hard to get back. Okay, so you should really cherish that. And lastly, discernment and advice. Take time to contemplate the decision. Talk to others for advice to help increase your odds of ethical behavior. If you're unsure that you're engaging in unethical behavior, maybe you're not sure if it's right or wrong, maybe talk to somebody else. So for instance, my friend in the $100, maybe if he would have called me up or maybe talked to someone else, I mean, I would say call me because I'm not part of that organization. Somebody else might have like reported him or something. I would have said, dude, that's wrong. Turn it in, do the right thing. But he did not. But maybe that would have been a good thing. So if you're unsure about the behavior that you're engaging in, try to talk to somebody else. This might increase your odds of doing the right thing rather than the wrong thing. So when we talk about domains of ethical theories, there is something called, this is not in your textbook, guys, but the reason why I included it is I feel like it's really useful for ethics. In addition, it's also good for you to use for your articles or for your characters, okay, for your film presentation. So ethical theories are going to fall under two broad domains: theories about conduct and theories about the leader's character. Okay. So ethical theories that deal with the conduct of leaders, they're divided into two kinds: the consequences and the duty, right? So the teleological theories, these come from the Greek word telos, which means end, goal, or purpose. So these deal with the consequence, right? So in other words, your conduct is related on the consequence. It focuses on the end of an action as to what makes that action praiseworthy or blameworthy. So in other words, think of war. A society can kill 100,000 people, but if they win, it's considered to be an ethical thing, right? So think of like any religious war. God was on our side, right? But I mean, really think about all the innocent lives that were taken, right? When we talk about deontological theories, this derives from the Greek word deon, meaning duty. These type of ethics focuses on motivation from an undertaking of an action. So in other words, it's sometimes referred to as a duty-based ethics. So in other words, it is my duty to do so. I have to do this kind of thing. Okay. And then there's the virtue-based theories. This focuses on who leaders are as people. So the idea here is that virtues are going to be rooted in the heart of an individual. They're not only solely innate. This is commonly what we think, right? The idea here is that only some people are virtuous. It's not true. If anybody's ever read Aristotle, the whole idea with his philosophy was that we as humans are innately flawed, but we have to continue to try to reach virtue. That's the very essence of us being, existing on earth, is to truly reach our virtue capability. So the idea here is that virtue can be acquired and learned through practice. You practice throughout your life to be virtuous. You should try to always be virtuous. So in other words, when you're young, you learn through your experiences and through the advice and teachings of your family members, friends, adults, etc., right? And through the experiences that you have by, so for instance, your parents probably tell you it's not nice to bully people. They tell you need to be respectful of your elders. You need to make sure that you listen to class. You need to make sure that you respect people, right? Depending on this is the reason why influence is so important, right? Because if your moral perceptions are skewed, you're going to skew everyone else around you, right? You're going to skew your children and how they view the world. So this is the reason why it's highly important that you remain open to perspectives and that you are ethical, right? So if you're teaching your children that, that it's wrong to murder, to steal, whatever, well, guess what? They're going to practice that over time and they're going to know that it's wrong. They're not going to engage in these principles, right? The idea is that through practice, it's going to become habitual and therefore it's going to become part of themselves, right? Does it make sense? Okay. Just to go a little more into these, right? So when we think about conduct, right, there is the ethical egoism. The states that a person should act so as to create the greatest good for himself. So ethical egoism, the egoism gives it away, right? The idea here is that although they're trying to be ethical, they're being ethical in a self-serving way. So for instance, let's say somebody who is, I don't want to say all philanthropists, but some people, they give away money because they're trying to get a tax rebate, right? And it's a good way to save money. So therefore they choose organizations that may be beneficial to them. So you can think of, like, for instance, any the college scandal that was going on, right? Where you found a lot of people of higher stature were paying for their children to be accepted to a university. They were contributing money to that higher learning in exchange for their child's acceptance. So that would be an example of ethical egoism, right? This here, the stance is closely related to a transactional type of leadership. So in other words, transactional, think of it like this, like money exchange, right? You work a certain amount of hours and I pay you for those hours. Same thing when it comes to ethical egoism. I'm going to do something for you, but you're going to do something in return for me. There's a reciprocal nature there, right? In utilitarianism, the states that we should behave as to create the greatest good for the greatest number. So in other words, this is about how it'll benefit the most people. You're trying to maximize social benefits while minimizing social costs. So an example of this would be like healthcare. One of the main principles that they try to use with extending healthcare to everybody was the argument that by teaching and promoting healthier lifestyles will prevent things like diabetes, and therefore it'll save us money in the end, right? It'll save people's lives and it'll save money in the end. That's an example of that. Do you see the rationale there? Versus altruism suggests that actions are more moral if their primary purpose is to promote the best interest of others. So here they're not thinking about themselves. They're thinking beyond their own self-interest. It's about other people. It's the ideal of ethics, right? That's also the most difficult one because it's very hard for us to think of others and not ourselves, right? So why is it central to why is ethics central to leadership? Well, because leaders engage followers and they utilize them in efforts to reach common goals. So our influence severely impacts those that we lead, right? So leaders who have an ethical responsibility to treat followers with dignity and respect are more inclined to create things like job satisfaction, right? If you're unethical, you're more likely to turn people off, right? We're going to talk more about this as the class continues, but it's really crazy because you're going to find that although within followers, you're going to find that some of those followers are going to break down into different type of subgroups, right? And some of them are going to be collaborators and some of them are going to be colluders, right? So the colluders they're there for what's easy, right? What can they benefit? And you're going to find that we are vulnerable. We have certain tics about us. This is how destructive leadership begins. I'm not going to go too much depth in it, but very, very interesting stuff, guys, because when you really, really think about it and you can really relate it to any historical thing, like I like to relate it to cults, you're going to find that it's crazy how people who can be educated or people who have come from good families can do terrible things. And you have to ask yourself why, right? But the idea here is that ethics is important because it's central to leadership. It helps to reinforce those organizational values. If you are an ethical leader and you are promoting those ethics, people are going to be influenced by that, right? So in short, ethics is central to leadership, right? You need to engage your followers to accomplish mutual goals. And you do this by being ethical. Any questions? Okay, so let's take like let's take a 5-minute break and reconvene at 12:38. And then we'll finish chapter 3. I'm sorry, guys, we're like lasting so long, but I'll try to run through chapter 3. And if I don't finish chapter 3, I actually did pre-record it. I'll just post that up there too, so that way you get it all. So that way those that are gonna be, those of you who are going to be presenting on the 10th have that available to you, okay? All right. So I'll see you guys at what? I said 5 minutes. Yeah, I like it. Let's do 12:37, okay? Just to be sure.